Imagine a staunchly secular, London-trained lawyer, someone who, fundamentally opposes mixing religion with mass politics.
Right.
Now imagine that exact same man becoming the founding father of an Islamic republic.
It's quite the pivot.
It really is. Today, we are unpacking what is probably the ultimate historical paradox. We're talking about Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Yeah, his trajectory is just fascinating.
Totally. And looking at this massive stack of historical texts, census reports, and journals sitting on the desk between us today, we are going deep into one of the most pivotal ideological shifts in modern history.
We really are.
We're tracking the growing rift between the Indian National Congress and Jinnah and the birth of the All India Muslim League. So our mission for this deep dive is to answer a genuinely fascinating question. How did Jinnah, a man who was literally once celebrated as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, eventually become the architect of an entirely separate nation?
Yeah, it is a journey full of contradictions, shifting alliances, and honestly, immense political miscalculations. But before we get into the mechanisms of this history, we really need to set some ground rules for you, our listener.
It's very important.
The sources we are working from today contain highly charged political and religious histories. I mean, they detail the actions, the rhetoric, and the perceived offenses of both Hindu and Muslim political factions during a very, very volatile era.
Exactly. So it is vital to state explicitly to you that neither of us here is taking a side, nor are we endorsing any of these historical viewpoints.
Right.
Our mission today is merely to impartially unpack the ideas exactly as they're presented in this historical source material. We're looking at the mechanics of the history, not judging it.
Precisely. And the reason this matters to you, whether you are managing a diverse team, studying political science, or just trying to understand the modern world, this history is really a masterclass in human dynamics.
Absolutely.
It shows us exactly how political fault lines widen in diverse societies and how missed opportunities for power sharing can, well, permanently alter the map of the world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when Alan Octavian Hume founded the Indian National Congress, or the INC, back in 1885, we all kind of know the textbook narrative, right?
Right, the great unifier.
Exactly. This is meant to be the great unifier. But looking at these census journals, the demographic math tells a much darker story from literally day one.
It really does.
And I'm struggling to understand something here. If the INC was founded to be this grand, unifying umbrella for all Indians, how did it immediately become so ethnically skewed? Was it like intentional exclusion or just an accident of who had access to education at the time?
Well, the sources debate this heavily, actually. Some texts argue the British created the INC merely as a safety valve.
A safety valve.
Yeah, like a controlled environment to let educated Indians vent political frustration so they wouldn't, launch peasant uprisings.
Yeah.
But that safety valve theory is really only a small part of the truth. The INC genuinely represented the urge of politically conscious Indians to create a national organization. The demographic skew, however, that was a reflection of the socioeconomic reality on the ground.
Right.
Muslims had fallen significantly behind Hindus in acquiring modern Western education and economic power following the 1857 rebellion. So when a political body was formed requiring English education and elite status,
They were just naturally underrepresented.
exactly.
I mean, the numbers in the text are incredibly stark. At the INC's very first session in 1885, out of 72 members, 58 were Hindus and only 2 were Muslims.
Yeah, it's quite a gap.
And fast forward to 1894, and it is 118 Hindus to just 20 Muslims.
Yeah.
If I look at this like a modern corporate board that claims to speak for all its employees, but the boardroom is almost entirely homogenous.
Right.
Alienation is just inevitable. You cannot claim universal representation when the room doesn't reflect the universe you are representing.
What's fascinating here is that a prominent Muslim leader of the time, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, saw the danger of that exact dynamic playing out.
He saw it coming.
He really did. He realized early on that any democratic representative system based purely on numerical headcount would permanently marginalize the Muslim community. I mean, in a straight numbers game, the demographic giant always wins.
Always wins, yeah.
So his advice to Muslims was to stay completely aloof from politics for the time being, and instead focus aggressively on acquiring Western education.
Because joining the political fray from a position of educational and numerical disadvantage would just lead to their structural suppression.
Exactly.
And that makes sense, especially considering what was happening within the ranks of the Congress at that time. Because during the late 19th century, you have the rise of extremist Hindu leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Madan Mohan Malaviya. The sources highlight how they began pushing a very pro-Hindu agenda within the Congress, including violent protests against cow slaughter. So the minority already feels structurally locked out of the boardroom, and then the majority starts flexing its cultural muscles in the streets.
Yeah, and once Sir Syed Ahmad Khan realized the demographic math would never favor Muslims, the battleground naturally shifted from numbers to culture.
Okay.
And the first casualty was language. Because language is never just about words, right?
No, of course not.
It is the fundamental vehicle of culture, administration, and economic survival.
Which brings us to the Urdu-Hindi language war, which the texts point to as a massive accelerant for the political fracture.
A huge accelerant.
So in 1867, a movement began where Hindus demanded that Urdu be replaced by Hindi in the Devanagari script for official use. Now, this was not just a symbolic debate over which font looked better on a government building. What did this actually mean for people on the ground?
It was an economic and administrative death sentence for a specific class of people. At the time, Urdu was the language of the courts and administration in certain provinces.
Right.
If you change the official language and the script to Devanagari Hindi, you are deciding who gets government jobs, whose legal documents are valid, and whose culture is recognized by the state.
Wow.
Yeah, and Sir Anthony MacDonald, who was the governor of the United Provinces, he eventually ousted Urdu from public offices. And the Congress threw its weight completely behind Hindi.
So Syed Ahmad Khan actually remarked in 1867, right as this controversy started, that because of this language friction, the two communities would never sincerely cooperate.
He called it right then.
He did. It is the moment cultural preference is institutionalized as administrative policy.
Yeah.
And this alienation directly fuels the birth of the All India Muslim League in 1906 in Dhaka.
Right.
The sources list 6 main catalysts for this, and they read like a step-by-step manual for a political split. We have the indifferent attitude of the Congress, the educational backwardness of Muslims, the Urdu-Hindi controversy.
All building up.
Exactly. And then the desire to save the Muslim entity itself, the success of the Simla deputation, and the upcoming Minto Morley reforms. I want to drill down into those last two, actually, because they seem to move the Muslim community from passive frustration to active political maneuvering.
Yeah, the Simla deputation in 1906 is just a masterclass in preemptive political survival.
Okay, how so?
So, a group of 35 elite Muslim nobles met with the British Viceroy, Lord Minto, in Simla. They argued that their political representation shouldn't just be based on their numerical strength, but on their historical and political importance.
Interesting.
They wanted preemptive protection before the British rolled out new constitutional reforms, and they actually succeeded. The Viceroy agreed to their demands.
Which leads directly into those Minto Morley constitutional reforms of 1909. The Muslim leaders realized that if the British were expanding electoral representation and Muslims didn't have their own political platform, they would be completely swept away at the ballot box. So the Muslim League is formed with 3 foundational goals: to safeguard the political rights of Muslims, to prevent prejudicial feelings against other communities, and rather remarkably, to create feelings of loyalty towards the British government.
Yeah, the irony of pledging loyalty to a colonial occupier is pretty hard to miss.
It is the ultimate alliance of survival, though, right? Marginalized groups will often ally with an occupying power because that foreign power is the only entity strong enough to protect them from being crushed by a local demographic majority.
That is exactly what it was. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the British eagerly exploited this survival instinct.
Oh, of course they do.
The Minto Morley reforms of 1909 didn't just give Muslims representation, they granted them separate electorates.
Right.
This mechanism meant that Muslims voted exclusively for Muslim candidates in reserved seats. So the British essentially institutionalized the idea that Muslims were a completely separate political entity. They embedded the religious division right into the electoral machinery of the country.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because despite the tectonic shift of separate electorates, the most prominent figure in the Muslim League for decades wasn't a separatist at all.
Not even close.
We come back to the paradox of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The sources describe the early Jinnah as a fierce advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity. He was an active lieutenant to Gopal Krishna Gokhale, a moderate leader within the Congress. Jinnah even actively opposed the concept of separate electorates at first.
He did.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Why would he oppose a mechanism designed to protect his own community?
Well, you have to remember, Jinnah was a brilliant London-trained lawyer. He was fundamentally secular in his personal life and a strict constitutionalist.
Okay.
He believed that separate electorates divided the nation artificially. Instead, he believes in negotiating legal frameworks for power sharing within a unified system. He was actually the chief architect of the 1916 Lucknow Pact.
Right, the Lucknow Pact.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a handshake, it was a highly complex mathematical framework.
Let's explore the mechanics of that pact, actually. How do you mathematically guarantee representation for a minority without using separate electorates?
So the Lucknow Pact used a system of weightage.
Waces.
Yeah. In provinces where Muslims were a minority, they were legally guaranteed a higher percentage of seats than their population numbers would strictly dictate. That way they wouldn't be drowned out.
Ah, I see.
And in return, in provinces where Muslims were in a majority, they accepted fewer seats to balance the national picture.
Wow.
It was a brilliant piece of constitutional engineering and a rare, shining moment where the Congress and the Muslim League agreed on a unified scheme.
And Jinnah was so committed to this legalistic constitutional approach that he stood as a lone dissenting voice against Mahatma Gandhi in 1920.
Yeah, that was a huge moment.
Because Gandhi was launching the Khilafat movement, which used mass religious mobilization to fight the British. Jinnah, standing on stage, warned that mixing religion with mass political agitation would lead to disastrous confusion. He was actually booed off the stage for saying it.
He was. It was a very unpopular opinion at the time.
So I have to ask, how does a secular, constitution-minded lawyer who warns against mixing religion and politics end up becoming the leader of a movement whose popular rallying cry becomes Islam in danger?
It's a great question. And the thing is, Jinnah's core desire for fairness and equitable power sharing never actually changed.
Really?
Yeah. What changed was his assessment of the political environment. As the years went by, Jinnah watched the Congress Party grow into a massive grassroots movement, and he began to realize that the common nationalism the Congress preached was, in practice, becoming a thinly veiled disguise for majoritarian dominance.
Which brings us to the absolute breaking point. The year 1937,
Yeah.
Jinnah had put forward his famous 14 points, which the sources describe as a moderate attempt at formal power sharing. He was asking for safeguards like ensuring Muslims had 1/3 representation in the central legislature.
Right.
And the Congress flat out rejected them.
They did. And then the 1937 provincial elections happened. The Congress won a massive sweeping victory. Jinnah and the League still expected to form coalition ministries, though.
Right, they assumed they'd work together.
They assumed they would share power in the provinces, but the Congress refused. They essentially told the Muslim League members that if they wanted a share of power, they had to dissolve their party and assimilate into the Congress.
It is literally the political equivalent of two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner.
That's exactly it.
The Congress essentially said, we won the majority. We are the only legitimate entity here. Your distinct identity and your desire for power sharing do not matter. Assimilate or be frozen out of the government entirely.
And it wasn't just political exclusion, it translated immediately into cultural imposition.
Right.
The texts are incredibly detailed about what happened when these Congress ministries took executive power in 1937. They began enacting policies that felt, to the Muslim minority, like the establishment of a Hindu Raj.
The everyday mechanics of this are striking, honestly. The sources note the state opened Vidya Mandirs, which translates literally to Hindu temples of learning as state-backed educational institutions.
Right.
They forced students to sing Bande Matram, a song with strong anti-Muslim undertones. They mandated the worship of Gandhi's portrait in schools, which is deeply offensive to Islamic beliefs against idolatry.
He is very offensive.
And, returning to our earlier point, they forcefully pushed Hindi over Urdu in the administration. I mean, if you are a Muslim living in those provinces in 1937, this does not just feel like your political party losing an election.
No, not at all.
It feels like your entire cultural existence is being erased by the machinery of the state.
And this raises an important question, one that political scientists still debate today. Can majoritarian democracy ever truly work in a society with deeply entrenched, unbridgeable cultural majorities and minorities? For Jinnah, the 1937 experience provided a devastating, definitive answer. He realized that in a unified India, majority rule would never mean a swinging pendulum of political ideas. It would simply mean permanent Hindu rule.
Because they're permanently outvoted.
Exactly. The Muslims would be a permanent outvoted underclass because people weren't voting on economic policy or foreign affairs. They were voting on permanent cultural identity.
You can persuade a voter to change their mind on tax policy, but you cannot persuade them to change their ethnicity or religion.
Exactly.
That realization sparks the final ideological shift for Jinnah. He stops asking for minority rights within a unified framework, and he starts demanding a completely separate nation. He adopts the two-nation theory.
Right.
Now, the sources note this theory was first articulated much earlier by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and later elaborated on by the philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal in 1930. But it is Jinnah who takes this philosophical idea and turns it into a hard political reality.
He makes a profound public declaration. He said, the Muslims are not a minority. The Muslims are a nation by any definition.
Wow.
Yeah. He argued that Hindus and Muslims belong to two entirely different civilizations, based on conflicting ideas, architectures, and histories. He concluded that yoking them together under a single state, with one as a permanent numerical minority and the other as a permanent majority, must inevitably lead to disaster.
This ideological pivot culminates in the famous 1940 Lahore Resolution.
The big turning point.
Yeah, the Muslim League formally demands the geographically contiguous Muslim-majority areas in the northwest and eastern zones of India be grouped into independent sovereign states, what would eventually become Pakistan.
And notice the strategic pivot Jinnah makes to achieve this. He doesn't just change his goal, he changes his entire methodology.
Right.
He transforms the Muslim League from an elite club of constitutional lawyers and wealthy landlords into a massive, unstoppable grassroots movement.
I am still struck by how effectively he weaponized the exact thing he used to despise: mass mobilization based on religious identity.
Exactly what he warned Gandhi about.
Right. He uses Islam endangered not necessarily as a theological statement, but as a socio-political identifier to artificially balance the scales of power against a demographic giant. Looking at the political board in 1940, it was the only weapon he had left to counter the sheer numerical reality of the Congress.
The tragedy, according to the analysis in these sources, is that the Indian National Congress desperately wanted to keep India unified.
Yeah.
But their consistent refusal to share power, their hubris after the 1937 elections, and their inability to respect the security and identity of the minority ultimately destroyed the very unified India they wanted to preserve.
They pushed too hard.
They insisted on a majoritarian system that gave the minority absolutely no room to breathe.
So what does this all mean? We started with the optimistic founding of the INC in 1885, where people hoped for a unified political umbrella. We saw that hope immediately chip away through demographic realities, educational disparities, and the bitter Urdu-Hindi language wars.
Step by step.
We watched Jinnah, a secular constitutionalist and the ambassador of unity, get his heart broken by the arithmetic of majoritarian democracy. And we saw how that heartbreak led to a complete strategic pivot, culminating in the 1940 Lahore Resolution and the demand for Pakistan.
And for you listening to this today, the story of the INC and Jinnah is a stark historical warning about human organization.
It really is.
It proves that in any institution, any community, or any society, if a minority feels that its core identity and its basic security are being chronically ignored by the majority, well, a fracture isn't just a possibility. It is an absolute inevitability.
You cannot just mandate unity or claim universal representation without building structures that make everyone feel secure within that system.
That leaves us with a final lingering thought to mull over. We know that the British actively encouraged this separation by granting separate electorates back in 1909, embedding religious division into the voting booths. It really makes you wonder, if the British hadn't designed the electoral machinery that way, would the political identity of India's Muslims have evolved differently? Might they have found a way to negotiate power within the Congress? Or was the cultural rift between the two communities so vast, so deep, that a unified India was always an impossible dream, doomed to eventually break apart?
Were the seeds of partition planted by colonial design, or were they sown the very moment those two diverse cultures first met? It is a heavy question, and one definitely worth sitting with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the partition. We will catch you next time.